All right, we're going to go ahead and start this session. So this is a big space, I realize, and people are a little spread out. The other request that we've had that will help with using this big space, but also for the people who are either watching remotely or are going to watch this on recording, is that we have to use the mics. So when you ask a question, I know it's going to seem a little clunky since it's a breakout session to use the mics, but that will help them in terms of having a recording that captures everything. So we'll try to do our best to run around with a mic if people have questions, but please don't let that hold you back from asking questions, because we're really hoping to have this be as much of a discussion as, in fact, probably more of a discussion than just a straight presentation. So I think what we wanted to accomplish today was to kind of give you an overview of how you might incorporate evaluation into the work that you do in your REU. And we're going to show a bunch of ideas at the end of things that you might consider evaluating. But in order to set that piece up, we wanted to kind of give you a framework or a way that you could make decisions about what it is that you're going to evaluate. So one of our assumptions was that some of the people here would be relatively new to evaluation. And when we go through some of those examples at the end, you're going to see things that look really good. But the reality is you can't possibly evaluate and implement all of them. You're going to have to be judicious about the items that you choose to evaluate for a couple of reasons. One, you can very easily wear out your REU students by giving them death by evaluation, where it goes on and on and on forever. Two, you're going to generate a lot of data for yourself, and so while you want to be careful, you're going to have a shot to collect data, so you want to get the data that you need. But if you get way too much data, you've now given yourself a ton of data that you're not going to use. So your students have put work into providing you with answers that you either just barely look at or don't look at all. So you want to be careful about getting that balance. So one of the ways to achieve that balance is by providing some organization or design to the evaluation that you put together. And a tool that's commonly used is a logic model. So how many people have a logic model already for their REUs? Okay. So a logic model is a visual description for what a project does and what changes it's hoping to accomplish. So when you finish creating a logic model, it should be a one-page description of your entire project that somebody could look at, and they could sort of understand what it is you're doing and the changes that you're hoping to generate at the end. I've given you a couple of examples where you can learn more. There's some really good readings and templates that on the it's a University of Wisconsin Cooperative Extension. They've got some nice resources. And there's a webinar, a nice webinar, and some templates at this group called evalu-8.org. And they're an NSF-funded facility to support evaluation within a wide variety of products and programs. They have a pretty nice list of webinars that you can go to learn basics like designing your logic model, but you can also then learn more advanced things like what's the benefit of using a retrospective pretest and how do you implement that. So there are everything from methods to broad sort of structures that you can use. So I'd highly suggest looking at their website. So here's what a logic model looks like. It's these boxes across the middle, and really you're just laying out what you're going to do. So the first box on the far left are your inputs. And these are new and existing resources that you're going to use to accomplish your project. So things like your funding go in here. Things like the faculty who participate as mentors in your program go in here. You might have some industry partners, depending on how your REU is set up, that go in there. They may contribute money. You may also get in-kind contributions from other programs or departments on campus that can help support your REU. So next to the inputs, you're going to list the things that you will actually do. What are those main things? And those could be developing curriculum in some cases, conducting workshops that you're going to run, providing a research experience, obviously. Maybe you'll have some field trips a part of that. Maybe you're going to have some cohort building elements. But you're really going to list those items out in the activities column. In the next column over, these are your outputs. these are going to be products that are created, and these are going to be typically things that can be observed or will continue to exist after the project ends. So they might be presentations, for example, or a webinar that will exist at the end. They might be things like a training session that you've run. That's a single shot. You have this training material that's now put together at the end. And then those outputs are going to then generate outcomes. And so this is one place where evaluation can get a little fuzzy for some people, is terminology like outputs and outcomes and objectives. And it gets really messy because evaluators will sometimes use them interchangeably, but don't get too frightened by it. So products go into the output column. Outcomes are things that you hope to generate change. And so what will happen as a result of what you've done? These are typically going to be changes these are going to be impact things, so changes in things like behavior, knowledge, skills, attitudes, those sorts of things. So short-term outcomes will be things like students gain technical skills. They'll become more proficient in coding in MATLAB. Or you might change their interest in some subfield of astronomy. You're going to have longer-term outcomes, so midterm outcomes. Next, students will persist in their programs, faculty improve instruction. Those are going to be something that can happen sort of in a middle time frame. And then a long-term outcome, these are going to be things like maybe you have a goal where you want to increase the diversity in the geoscience workforce. So these are going to be things that are going to be the big sort of changes that you want to make in the system as a whole, and this shows how your program maps into that. So I'll work you through one simple example that I've put together here. So on the far left, I have inputs, and this is from my REU. So we've got some time in my REU award to work on this particular project. So I'm showing you one element of my project. The activities, we're going to develop promotional materials. We're going to promote our REU site online and from booths at places like SACNAS, GSA, NABG, and others could be listed there. We do it at AGU, but this was what I put together quickly this morning. And we also run a minority recruitment lecture series where we send alumni from our internship program out to physics departments to give talks to recruit students to come to our REU program. So what is produced? Well, we're going to produce advertising flyers, a web page, some materials like that. We're also going to be producing personal contacts and contact lists that we can then follow up with. And we're going to produce some talks, so the actual speakers visiting the HBCUs and the HSIs. Those are the outputs, the things that we're producing. So what are my outcomes? Well, my outcomes start on with annually, EPO staff will recruit an intern application pool that contains at least 15% racial and ethnic minority. For some of you, that sounds horribly small, but if you are familiar with the seismology community, we're very male and we're very white. So that's actually a bit of an improvement. Actually, we bumped that number up a little bit. The midterm outcomes, so what do I want to happen next, sort of in a longer term? That annually, and we could actually do this, I actually use this more as an aggregate. So over a certain year average, so over a 3-year average, EPO staff will ensure that the population of interns accepted into the internship program is more diverse than the population of geoscience faculty. And then my long-term outcome is within 15 years, the diversity of the geophysics community will increase by at least 10%. So I hope that shows how we can go from an activity that we want to do to products we might produce to then outcomes that we can actually measure and collect some data on, and then long-term outcomes that would be changes in the whole system. Now, we might not be able to attribute all of those changes back to my REU, but I certainly would never try to make that claim that I'm the only reason that the geophysics community changed its demographics. So I know that we're going to put these on the Google Drive so that people can create their own. This is a simple template. You can actually move all those boxes around and type in them. So if you want to make your own logic model, you can use this PowerPoint slide to actually work in that PowerPoint slide. I'd note, for some of you that want to get a little more serious with this, I use a tool called OmniGraffle. It's just a graphics tool that allows you to create boxes and link them together. It's really easy to use, and I'd recommend it as a place to work in. So, questions on logic models at this point?
When I think of an REU program, I start thinking of posters and talks and those sorts of outcomes that we're having the students do, and I don't see that stuff in here. Sort of how are you thinking about that, and would you do a separate one for sort of what you want the students to do?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I have framed this based on, this is one sort of row driven by the outcome that I have. So you might have an outcome that's further down that 90% of your participants will give a talk at a professional conference. So that might, each year. So that might be your outcome. You would have a row below this that would include that outcome, and then you would map back out, okay, what are the activities that you're going to do that would contribute to that? What are the outputs that happen along the way? And those might be things like we run an abstract writing session partway through, and then the output is the abstract that they actually submit to AGU or GSA. And so you would just have a separate row for each one of those outcomes. I tried to simplify it here by only showing just one example. Okay, so the other thing that I'll just briefly mention is that I tried to use examples of my outcomes here that are what we'd call SMART, right? So a lot of you have objectives probably written in your project plans. Some of them may be SMART, and some of them may not be. And the problem with an objective or an outcome that is not SMART is that it's really difficult to evaluate it because you're not making any claim about what you're going to actually change. So a SMART objective is one that's specific about what you're going to achieve. It's measurable, so you can focus on how much or to what degree. It's achievable, so you want it to be something that isn't so idealistic that you'll never ever reach it, but you want it to be something that was going to cause your program to stretch. And I wouldn't get too hung up on this one. I've written, a renewal for my REU, and I've changed my outcomes and said, look, this just wasn't achievable. We weren't even getting close. But here's a more realistic one. Here's some new things that we're trying to achieve that. So don't get too hung up on it being set in stone. It needs to be realistic, and it needs to be time specific. So you have to have some time frame that it's going to actually occur in. Whoops. So you want to think about what will you do. You want to think about who you're going to do it with and when it's going to happen. And then what do you expect as your impact at the end? What's going to change as a result of it? And so again, we can think about this, an example from my REU, which is a distributed REU. So the students are not in one place together. They're remotely placed all over the country, and we interact through a variety of cyber infrastructure. So we're going to use online tools to deliver content and facilitate connections among the students. Who are we going to do this with? Well, the interns in my program, and I should have added the mentors there. When? Well, this will happen annually. And what do I expect? Well, I expect that at least 80% of the interns each year will agree or demonstrate that they were connected to the other interns in some sort of a beneficial way. And so when I put that all together, I have a statement written at the bottom that sort of summarizes all those chunks into what we'd consider to be one SMART objective, something that's specific, time-bound, achievable, and all the other elements there. If you want to if you haven't done a lot of these, there's a tool that you can use online that you can plug in who will do the work, how is it measurable, achievable, and realistic, what action, what's the unit of measurement, what will be measured from X to Y. In this case, I was just filling in an example. Jim Bob in the truck is going to move stumps out of the yard, and he's going to change them from one that's in there to none. And so it'll then give you a SMART objective at the bottom. Personally, I find this tool a little constraining because you're limited to the actions and the units of measurements in the drop-downs, but it's a good place to start to kind of get a feel for how you can frame SMART objectives. But both of these tools, SMART objectives and logic models, will set up what items you choose to measure and what tools you want to use to actually go about collecting that data. So if you haven't gone through this process, I'd strongly recommend starting to sit down and practice with it. And then if you have questions, you can email. Lots of people in the community can give you feedback on a logic model or SMART objectives, or give you suggestions on how to get going with it. So any questions on SMART objectives before we kind of step on to a few other examples? Okay.
Okay. A lot of you might recognize this. This is a consent form. So we're talking a little bit about IRB, institutional review, if you do human subjects research. And if you want to report on any of your data, you will have to go through the IRB process. And we want to put this out there. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but I'm a natural scientist by training. I came in and I had no idea what this IRB was, and it really is kind of a daunting process initially, but it's not that bad. And most institutions actually have an IRB office. They are very helpful. At University of Colorado, they have people that really, they provide a lot of guidance, they provide templates, and this is a template for a consent form. So what you will have to do, and I recommend you do that, well ahead of your students arriving, is that you put together a protocol, and there it's usually guided. It varies by institution, but you have to describe what you're going to do, who you're going to do it with, how many students, for how long, how much time. And it's actually an interesting process to go through because you have to be very specific. What do I want to do? You have to really have your evaluation or a research plan mapped out. So there's a lot of people in the community that have gone through the process. If you're new to this and it's daunting, just send an email out on the listserv. We are all more than willing to help or share consent forms. This is just to show this was the template that we have to work from in Colorado, but they are, I think they are mostly standardized across the country. So you will have to have all your students sign a consent form. Another thing that you should really do, it's not for the IRB process, but it's for you being able to use photos of your students. You should have them all sign a media release form, and you did this for this workshop here, but make sure you have your students do that too. And the other thing, don't just think about your students, also think about your mentors. We also collect a lot of data from our mentors, and you're not allowed to use that data, especially if you want to write publications, if you have to have the mentors also sign a consent form. You can put them online mostly. There's like different clauses in there in the protocol. You have to go, it's a slightly different format. It's pretty simple. You can have the students, if you do, for example, we do REU interviews, so we don't even see the students beforehand. Either you send them a package where they sign everything beforehand, or we actually have them sign an online consent form before they come and join our program. Are there any questions about IRB?
How many people have an IRB already in place for their site?
I have a question. If you're not planning to publish your data, you're just using it for tracking for your NSF report, you don't need this necessarily, do you?
You don't. If you don't publish it, at least that's the stance you might want to check with your institution. Evaluate only pure evaluation that you're not going to publish. Our IRB office doesn't want to see that. So if it's just formative, if you're just trying to improve your program, but you might at some point, you start out now and things are going well, and maybe you want to write a paper at some point. So it's not, it takes a little bit of time, but then you can use your data.
Can you go back and get an IRB for things that have happened in the past that you may want to include in an evaluation publication?
So you have to talk to your IRB office, and they may walk you through the process, and you can do that. For example, in the first year, we had the pre-interview, and we didn't think about having to have the IRB before, and the students came, and then they did the IRB, and our office said, you know, we had to ask the student, are you okay for us to use the data that we already collected? And it's a little clunky process, but it's possible. I've never done it going back to cohorts that you are not really in touch anymore with, but it's definitely possible.
I was just going to comment that Lena had asked us to, as part of receiving our grant, that we needed to get an IRB, but you have to go through the process. But in a lot of these cases, what the committee comes back and says is that you actually don't need one. So a lot of times, you put in your stuff and they'll say, okay, you're good to go.
Just want to clarify the language. The IRB board may deem your plan exempt from human subjects rule. I don't remember the actual regulation, but that doesn't mean that you don't need it. You need to be told that it's exempt from a higher level scrutiny. And just to clarify, it's based on practice at NSF. In the Division of Earth Sciences, I require the IRB upfront because I do encourage the PIs to share the results and publish the results of their REU.
And one of the things that we also didn't think about when we wrote our protocol was that we wanted to track our students. You know, we were very focused. We had our plan for the summer, and it was all lined out, and then we wanted to track the students. So one thing you can do later is you can amend your IRB. So you're going to submit your surveys, and they're going to be, you know, if you're all scrambling, you're getting it together, they have to be, they can be drafts. But then later, you go back and say, and amendments are pretty quick. You just say, well, we're actually using these questions. So you can go back and even ask for amendments later.
I think I have a question. I don't know, like when you're talking about IRB and then you're talking about evaluation. So I think my question is like, do you intend to cover the same kind of topic or just different thing, you know, like, because actually just now when you talk about the, you know, evaluation, the logic models, and I was thinking, oh, you are talking about IRB. So, or, you know, I mean, like, do I understand it correctly, or you actually try to, you know, emphasize something different from IRB?
Do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I'll try to answer this. So you don't have to have a logic model to submit your IRB. So your IRB is going to be submitting the actual survey or the interview questions, and they're looking for the safety of the subjects, the students in this case and the mentors in this case that you'll be working and collecting data with. You don't have to have a logic model in place as part of the IRB process. They're really looking at the data that you're actually collecting. But the logic model helps you decide what data you actually want to collect. So if we go back a couple slides here, and we look at this, so you might, sometimes I'll actually insert a column after each outcome, and I'll insert a column on measure. And I'll put a box on how I'm going to measure that outcome. And so, for example, what data do I need to collect if annually I'm going to ensure that we recruit an applicant pool that has X percentage of racial and ethnic minorities and gender distribution? I have to make sure that I have that data in order to assess that outcome. And if I'm going to collect that data, I have to submit those questions to the IRB so that they can be approved.
So pretty much you can use it as a guideline.
That's right.
But you don't have to follow.
That's right. You can use this to help drive and shape what the data collection instruments look like.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, one more comment I want to provide about the IRB question, because in my program, we happen to have to work with the IRB officers on 2 schools. And then my suggestion is that if you have any question about your IRB, you need to check with the specific officer who's going to give you the approval. Because in my case, I do get different answers, which turns out take a longer than I expected time. At first, I thought I could do the exam, because one of them told me, you can exam, you don't have to do the whole process again when I renew my program. But it turns out no. The other one says, no, you have to do it all from the beginning. Although you certainly can use what you had used before, but you still need to go through the process. So it's always a good idea to check with the officer who will give you the final approval. So.
Yeah, I hope that clarified. And so just to, to help with thinking about this, you come up with the logic model, you come up with your plan, then you write it up in a protocol where you probably go back and fill some holes. You have your draft instruments, but if you do change throughout collecting data, you always have to go back and amend. But if they are exempt, it's pretty straightforward. So just briefly also, because some of you are new to evaluation, we now want to we hope we've given you some framework to think about evaluation and how to collect data. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what types of data you can collect. And to start out with, there's obviously the difference between formative and summative evaluation. And formative evaluation is providing your program with information how to improve it. So you can ask about logistics, you can ask about mentor match, you can ask about, any question that you as a program manager might want to use to make your program stronger. That's formative, that's really informing your program. And if you're only doing that, back to your question, Raphael, you don't need an IRB. You have to go through the process, especially for NSF, to say, I'm only doing evaluation, and they're going to say you don't have to go through the process. Summative assessment is really when you want to measure your outcomes, when you want to see what's the impact on the student. It's like the thought about impact. What does my program, what are the outcomes of the program, and how do I measure those? So that is really the difference between the two. And if you want to publish about your REU, you will certainly want to collect data on impact on your students. Any questions about the broad difference? Okay, so we now going to jump into a few examples, and I think Michael and I, we're going to just talk about different things we do, and feel free to chime in and say, in our program we actually do this, so we're hoping now to have this be just, share out what is possible. So in terms of front-end examples, I've mentioned this before. In our program, we do a pre-program interview where we ask the students about their expectations, about how, where they see challenges, what they're excited about. We also ask them about their career plan, so we have a baseline. So we are collecting a lot of baseline data where we then later can say, okay, they were, they've never done research before, they were not sure where they were going to go, and now they are motivated for a PhD program, or things like that. So it's really collecting both the baseline for our summative evaluation, but it's also helping us expect what these students are going to be like. And we actually have a graduate student do this. It's not one of our program staff, to make this not so, just to lower the barrier of maybe sharing. The students have actually shared, what they are really nervous about, and that they don't even know why they were selected and things like that. And then we address that in the first week. We also measure grit, perceived confidence, self-efficacy. Now we're talking about some baseline measures where we see what do they come in with. We do this really early on, and then we measure it again at the end, and that helps you in reporting changes that happen in your program. How? So I can speak to the grit and perceived confidence. There are validated instruments. I'm happy to share them. That the ones we use, they are one amazing database is actually the iTest program. The Stellar website has a website for evaluation tools, and you can go in there and they have the tools, they have descriptions, they have people report how they used it, what the context was. And so they are the grit and perceived confidence, I can say I'm happy to share, and these are validated instruments. Do you want to?
Sure. So I would also add here, so this is something that I measure self-efficacy, and I also use a validated instrument called the General Self-Efficacy Scale, with some additions added to it, but there are, with that scale, there are instructions on how to generate additional items to add on to it. So in each one of these, this is an idea that we've decided in our programs is important and we want to measure because we're trying to make a change in those particular ones. You might have other aspects that you are really interested in measuring, and they may not be those ones. These may not be the right ones for your emphasis. So we're not suggesting that you have to do these. I think what's there is that you should spend, if you have a skill or a construct that you want to measure, if you look around, there's probably some validated instruments out there. And validated instruments means that the instrument measures what it claims to measure. It's been tested with large enough populations, and it's also been tested with a diverse enough population to ensure that it is measuring that idea. You can construct your own items as well. And there are some times where you will find things that there just is nothing out there, so that you have to actually generate your own questions. But again, I'm happy to share what I use for self-efficacy as well if people want to. And I think that if you put questions out onto the list and say, hey, I'd like to try to measure how my students change in this area, who collects data on this, lots of us would be willing to share our questions. So.
And we also, one.
We'll repeat it.
Do you find that the students at the beginning of the REU? Oh, do you find that the students at the beginning of the REU overestimate their skill sets, such that if you compare it to, yes, I am the greatest communicator on the planet, before they even start the program, and then at the end, they're putting down, yeah, I'm still very good.
Yeah, so that's
you don't measure growth in there.
Right, so that's a really well-known bias, and actually what you end up seeing in your data is a decline in their communication skill, because or in this case, it might be their quantitative skills, because at the end they realize, I really don't know as much as I thought I knew on this topic. So one way to get around that is use something called a retrospective pretest. And it's where at the end of the summer, you actually ask them both how they were coming in and how they are now at the end. And the idea here is that they actually now have a better understanding of what you're trying to measure. And so they're able to more accurately report both their pre-status and their post-status. And if you go to that evalu-8.org, there's a whole webinar on using the retrospective pretests idea and how to construct items, because there's a correct way to offer those on your survey, and once you see the format, you'll be able to quickly create items to use that address exactly that question.
So, would you suggest that we don't even offer these pre-tests for that reason?
I can tell you what I've done. Yeah. I've stopped. I do ask them I should say I cut down on them to really specific things where I want to use it for a formative assessment to shape what I do, like in my orientation week. Or I use it I'm using the assessment to drive my instruction. That's the only reason I ask it. I don't attempt anymore to try to incorporate it into my summative data. At the end, it's not worth it.
We use, one of the measures we use is the test of science literacy, TOESL, I don't know whatever that acronym stands for, and that test has them plot graphs, it's measuring actual skills, and there you can actually see, do they put units, do they put, things like that. So where we actually measure the skills, those we definitely do still in the beginning. Is there anyone else who does anything else as the front-end evaluation?
We do something similar. It might be just a little different. We do the paper reading one with a little bit of a twist, is we do ask the students, how their paper reading skills, and they all say they're the greatest, at reading papers. But the other thing we do is we do an exercise where about a month beforehand, we have them meet with their mentors via Skype, and the mentor actually gives them papers, and then when they come back, their first week, they have to review the papers with the mentors, and we ask the mentors to then assess the paper reading skills of the students. As you might expect, they have a very different ranking, and then we do a kind of a midway review, and then you start to see the students almost like a U-shaped curve. They go from, yes, I was good, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I'm not really that good at it, and then we do the post one, and then they're back up there, and then by the end you're seeing that the mentors and then the students are tracking each other by the end. So it's very similar, but a little bit of a twist with that starting point.
One of the things we've done is using eye tracking. So we've had the students read a scientific paper, a science paper, because it has to fit on one page, and read graphs, and ask them some guided questions, and then we compare them to experts, so we can see what's the difference between novice and experts. But I know that's like way beyond what you can do in a REU where you don't have funding to do a lot of evaluation. All right, let's go to. That was a nice segue that you track the middle. There are midway examples. A lot of those are certainly formative, where you want to see where do we stand, where's the program, where do we need to improve. Clearly surveys is good. In our program, we do weekly logs. So we have every student log some data just to housekeeping, what they are doing, but we do put in some questions. And here we actually put in a lot of open-ended questions where we have the students describe what they learned, what their challenges were. And there is where we see a lot of this data, what we are all kind of, when you hear Melissa Bird's story, that's where this feeling like a scientist or struggling like a scientist, where all of this comes in. So the front end for us is a lot of quantitative, and then we have the students report throughout the program, both in these weekly logs and then through blogging, talk about their experience, and we use that and take the qualitative data and code it and use it as examples to use case studies to show change in a qualitative way. Do you want to talk about the whiteboard talks?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the whiteboard talks, this is a good example. Again, this is used for formative assessment. How do we know how the student's understanding their project? How do you know how things are going in the mentor-mentee relationship? And this is something that some of you may have heard mentioned. I think Val mentioned it yesterday in the session on communicating science. They basically go up to a whiteboard. You give them 5 minutes to give them an overview of their research so far, and they have no slide preparation. They have to draw it all on the whiteboard. And it's a chance for you to see student understanding, and you may also detect some issues going on in the progress of that student, and it may sometimes be a mentor-mentee relationship issue. It may be that the mentor is, you may uncover that they haven't made much progress because the mentor hasn't been around for 2 weeks. They've been at a conference, or a variety of issues. So it's a chance for you to just check in and see how things are going live. Another version of it that I do is post your central figure right now that best represents your research. It doesn't have to be a finished figure, and then write a descriptive caption to go with it. So the idea is that would become the core figure probably in their poster that they prepare later on. But it's the same idea as a whiteboard talk, just a chance to check in on how things are going.
And I know we don't do it, but I think other groups do it. I can't remember which group told me about this, but they meet with mentor and mentee and have the two of them do the whiteboard talk, where the mentor is actually present, which raises the bar a little bit, makes it less, you make it a little bit more high stakes, but then it really helps the communication between mentor and mentee, and the mentor all of a sudden sees, well, the student really doesn't understand the big picture, and that kind of sometimes helps new communication between the mentor and the mentee. Are there any other approaches to mid-program evaluation?
I like this midpoint assessment. I don't think we've done it in the Penn State Climate REU. All I've done, it's my first year directing, and a week or two after, I just I just knock on everybody's door or call them, both the mentor and the mentee. You know, how's things going. But I like this. It's a little bit more formal, and all right, Whiteboard. I mean, are you doing this all online? Is this because you have a distributed REU?
Right. So for mine, I don't do the whiteboard talks because we're all distributed.
Okay.
I actually use the post your figure and describe it as a way for us to do it in a blog. And that way the faculty member can go and see the figure and read the description.
Oh, I see.
So we can do it all virtually. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's similar to the whiteboard talk, but modified to
So
be
you just tell them, you know, by Thursday at 3 o'clock this week, post your single figure, and then everybody can see it, I guess.
Yep.
Is it the other students can see it as well, and the mentors can look at it, you can look at it, and then...
And we all comment on it. Then there's a threaded discussion that occurs about it. So
Okay.
after they've presented it, then we have a little discussion about it.
Right, right.
And we actually do it in person. We're not distributed, and we've done it for the first time this year. And in our post-evaluation, the students said this was one of the most useful things they've done.
Okay.
And we actually didn't tell them beforehand. It was to not have anxiety. We work with two-year college students. Some of them struggle with anxiety. So they knew beforehand a little bit, but we didn't tell them weeks before that, so they would stress and come with a PowerPoint.
Okay. So when did you pop it on them?
Can't remember. Beck, do you remember? I think. Yeah.
Oh, so this is so your REU is a part of the SOARS?
No, it's a Boulder-based.
Okay.
It's at the University of Colorado for community college students, but we have Beck as a consultant to do a skill training model from the SOARS.
All right, and
workshop.
about when do you do that? This slide or whiteboard or
think
thing? How many weeks in?
It's about halfway.
Just about halfway.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. All right, thank you.
Can I add a quick follow-up comment? We've used the idea of drawing the figure as a way to get them to think clearly about their proposal at the beginning as well. And we find that extremely valuable because then they're thinking about causality and what are the variables they're actually measuring. And it's a very valuable tool there, and I could see it'd be very nice to then visit that again.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. We actually do elevator speeches in the second week where we have them and we record those and send them to NSF. But we have the students because they will be walking around the NOAA building and people are like, who are you? What are you doing? You know, and so that they can pull out their elevator talk and have their 3-minute description of the project. And that really helps everyone to focus a little bit. So that's what we do early on too. Okay, end of program. Some of you might know this polar bear. It's one of the widely used instruments in undergraduate research self-assessment. It's the so-called URSA test. It was developed, I don't know, many years ago, and there's an online version, and we provide the link to it, but it's one of these, it's a post-evaluation, but it measures gains. So a lot of the questions ask, how much did you gain in X, Y, Z? So it's like this retrospective pretest where the students are asked, what is their gain? So that's really, it has a lot of questions, and there's an online version, but you can modify it to use...
Shrink it.
Shrink it, yes. And for example, it's for the 2-year college, there were a number of questions we couldn't ask or we had to modify, but you really want to shorten this a little bit, but it's a validated instrument where there's existing data out there, so you can compare your results to other people's results, which is interesting when you want to write a paper. And there's obviously interviews. We do reflective surveys with a lot of open-ended questions to get at this, you know, what is the feeling about, what do students talk about, what do they say, and not just on a scale. And yeah, this is what we do for
If I understand correctly, so I've gone in and I've reviewed a lot of the URSA stuff, and we do something that's sort of modified from it, but I think they say that you can't use it technically if you have fewer than 10 students in your program. So, like I said, we're basically doing the same thing, but I can't officially say that we're using the URSA process, but I want to know what you think about that. I think it's a confidentiality thing, that if you have fewer than 10 students, you can tell who's who.
What's actually nice is they have aggregate scores, so they have, I think, 5 main scores that where they compile answers to questions to how much did they gain in thinking about thinking about themselves as a scientist. There's 5 different constructs, and they aggregate the responses. So what we do is we actually use these 5 constructs. They're also a lot easier to report on than the million questions in the URSA. And if you want, I can send, there's a paper by Weston and Larson that describes this and also the challenges. But we still use it. In our first year, we had 7 students, and so we still use that.
Some of it may have to do with the reliability question and the validity of the actual items. Sometimes there's constraints on how many students have to take it in order to be able to draw certain conclusions. But it's a good example. I wouldn't shy away from it because you have fewer than 10. So the other thing that's going on is the biology REU is developing a modified version of this. So they're all going to a common evaluation tool, and some people are really excited about it, and others are a little less excited about it. There was quite a lot of conversation about this, but it's being piloted by some folks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who are developing it, and I'd recommend that you take a look at it as well, because they've taken those items and modified it to fit what the community has decided they're interested in, and it's a slightly different version, but worth looking at as well. And can they get access to it, Lena? Do you know? Can they get into it? Oh, it's not working. Oh, all right. Sorry about that. That was just a tease. I saw it working at one point, but not anymore, or the pilot of it. Okay.
Can you elaborate on your tracking? Just always curious about who does what.
So I can say what we do, but what I've learned from, I actually asked that question, how others are used track on the listserv, I think in December last year, 2015. And there was an amazing discussion about it, especially there were different sites sharing what they do, and I think it's worthwhile going to the listserv and looking at that question. What we do is we do survey. We have a longitudinal survey about 6 months in, and it's very interesting how perceptives change over 6 months. We had, and I've shared the story, we've had a student that was kind of at the end upset and said, why are you doing this? Why are you putting so much money in these individual students and doing these silly projects? I think it's not a good use of taxpayers' money, is what she said at the end of the REU, and we were kind of frustrated. And then 6 months later, we did the survey. She was the first one to respond to the survey, and she said, I had no idea how much this REU changed my academic career. And it's interesting to do this longitudinal survey, and I don't know, this is just a compressed version of this story. But we do a survey. Our REU has only run 3 years, including pilot now, and so we've done the survey every year, but I think we're going to stop to not over-survey. We'll try to be a little bit more selective about who we survey so they don't have to say the same old thing again. So we are in the process of figuring out how to track.
Well, yeah, it's keeping in touch with them and getting responses is the big thing. And so, there are lots of little tricks, right? Like, it's a lot better if I send them a personal email to the students and I show, in that email, I include pictures of myself on vacation with my kids and say, hey, here's what we did this summer. Because really, we're interested in keeping in touch with them anyway, for the most part. But I find that if I send the email and with a link in it for them to fill it out, that gets me a higher response rate than if I have somebody else send it or some automated system send it, because it is that personal connection that's really important. The other thing that we're currently doing is building a system to pipe responses so that you don't have to, The intern doesn't have to always enter the exact same information every year. We already know, because we've been running for so long, we already know what their current employment was the last time we asked them 3 years ago. So we don't want to have to ask them again because it may not have changed. It's already in there. So anything that we can do to make it more efficient on their end helps increase our response rate. So that's one of the ways we're able to get a higher response rate.
Very quickly, sitting on some of the panels for the REUs, often the REU panels are made up half of educators and half of scientists. And the conflict in the room is fairly substantial in that the educators want a lot of money spent on external reviewers. They don't want us doing the assessments. And I view the money that goes to an external reviewer as money that could be spent on another student when it's well documented that these experiences are making a difference. So while we have to do assessments, but how much we do assessments, it becomes very frustrating for me.
And I guess that's why we started with this logic model. It's really, what do you want to know? And we've put out a lot there, and you can totally over-survey your students, and not just the students, but the workload on analyzing the data and making sense of the data is large. So it's a good question because, you know, everyone in the room knows that staff time is extremely limited on the regular RUs unless there is some supplemental funding. So it's a good question.
So one thing I might add there is, it is a good question, and we do there's lots of papers out about the skill development that students get and those sorts of things. But the goal of the evaluation is for your program to demonstrate that there's a high likelihood that you're going to get those same results. And so you can do that in a couple ways. One way is by noting from the literature base, so developing a needs assessment. So saying, okay, from the literature, here are the things that the literature says generate these outcomes. And then you want to be able to ensure or document through your evaluation that you have those elements, and you can use a sort of a therefore, right? We have these things, the literature suggests this is powerful, therefore we assume we are going to generate those claims. And if you're not interested in doing, say, research or publishing on your REU, it's a way to show that it's likely that your program is successful based on existing literature. So being aware of that existing literature is still really important, and it's a way that you don't have to, you don't need to see how self-efficacy plays a role in the REU, a research experience for a student, unless you're interested in that.
I'm curious, just to ask the group a question, how many people are using education experts at their university for doing evaluations? So it's a good number. And so you were kind of complaining about that. Is it costly? Yeah. Okay. So we're spending. I'm sorry. Yeah. Right. There's a tension there. Sure.
Sorry, I'm not complaining about the assessments at all.
I-
What I'm complaining, what my concern is,
Yeah.
can we not do it effectively in a way that's not biased for gathering the results? Because it might be cheaper if we could do it in-house in some way.
There are definitely models for that, where you might build your survey instruments with an evaluator, and then you might use those instruments that were to help you collect the data, but you might then work on data collection yourself. You might try to aggregate the results and then work with an external evaluator at the end to try to sort of bring those ideas sort of together and to have them help you write the final report, because then they're going to look at the data and they're going to say, okay, you're cherry picking this data, right? You're only showing the highlights. So having the external person, it can be useful, but it doesn't mean that they have to do every single step of the process.
Yeah, we found it useful at REU, and they're, I thought, quite cheap. Like 1 week of someone in it's called Teaching and Learning with Technology. It's a place at Penn State. 1 week of their time per year. That's the time I don't have to spend doing it. So
And you
for
might
us,
want to
it's
think
well
about
worth it.
using students too. We use a lot of student time for analysis. You have to include them in your IRB, but yeah. I just want to say that both of us, as I said earlier, we have hard deadlines. We have to leave at 11. So the session is, maybe Beck, you have one more question, and then we might have to defer to discussions.
Yeah, I was
later.
interested in whether there would be any interest in creating a complete single evaluation fits all that we could literally survey our own students. It would be aggregated at a common source. We could get results from our own REUs, but all of it together could work towards a joint understanding. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether that's something that people would be interested in.
How many people would be interested in that? If there was a tool that you could use and modify, it's pretty unanimous. Yeah. Everybody could use it, yeah.
Do you have something from Lena?
It was the same question.
Okay. Yeah.
You guys have to do the IRB, we don't have to do it then.
Well,
Well, if we administer the survey, we can have the IRB run at our institutions. You still have to have them sign the consent form, but you wouldn't have to do it. But we could go through the process at our institution if the data is only going to us and not to you.
right. But that would be the difference then. That would mean at AGU or GSA or AMS, you couldn't put a poster up on how successful your program is and show the results. If you don't have an IRB, you can't publish those results.
Yeah. We could report to you.
But we can use it in our report to NSF.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. It's 11.
Sorry.
Sorry.